Chapter 404, Akio Nirvana. Friday, October 25, 1996. Gryffindor Tower Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizard United Kingdom Atlantis, DEFCON status. 4/1. 6% Hermione Granger had gotten hooked on the Buddhist meditation practices as soon as she had bought the book at a Muggle New Age bookstore which had opened up in Hogsmeade. Interest in Buddhism had skyrocketed as soon as Buddhist techniques had been incorporated into Samuelist teachings. There were a few books on Samuelism out as well, though Hermione suspected that Samuelism would start getting more publications once the Omega Conference completed. Having been raised secular Anglican herself, she knew very little about Buddhism. She could see, however, that traditional Abrahamic beliefs could mesh pretty well with the teachings of the Buddha. After all, most of the meditation practices were non-theistic, so even more rigid Abrahamics could adopt them without denying belief in one God. She was going to try to adopt a 10-minute meditation practice each day. Finding time for it was often hard, considering her work as a prefect and her interviews with the Muggles. However, she figured she'd be able to do it right after she woke up or something like that. She opened the book and cast the spell which caused it to turn to the page where she had left off. It was entitled, Metta, Loving Kindness Meditation. Very interesting, she thought. Was this a meditation which made you a little friendlier? She figured it couldn't hurt. The chapter explained how one started out in a loving kindness practice by loving yourself, then trying to extend the circle to include relatives, then friends, and so forth. Eventually, the circle got large enough to encompass the whole world. The Buddha understood that going from the ground level to loving the whole world couldn't be accomplished in one jump, so the worshipper had to go step by step. Hermione thought that might actually work. She'd try it when she got a chance. Intriguingly, the text referred to a case in the Old Testament where the practitioner, in this case, the classical Cohen Gadol, managed to relate to the community as a whole in a similar fashion on Yom Kippur. The Cohen Gadol would first atone for himself, then for his family clan, and then eventually for the entire community. She wondered if the Cohen Gadol had managed to accomplish this feat over the past Yom Kippur. Finishing her daily reading, she meditated for a few minutes, did some homework, and then looked over the latest excerpt from the proposed Hermione Granger and the Philosopher's Stone. It was discussing how her parents had thought that her unusual behavior had been due to hallucinations, either their parts or hers. The brain template necessary for a 150 ick had to have a few drawbacks with it. Instances of this problem would recur with increasing regularity until her parents received the note from Hogwarts, which explained what the underlying cause had really been. She corrected some of Rowling's texts and then sent them back to her. She was about to get back to her reading when H.J. Potter at Hogwarts, UK, raced in with a computer printout in his hand. Professor Flitwick had proven to be as curious about the computer in the headmaster's office as Dumbledore had been, and he had put in a request for each house to have its own computer. In the meantime, Flitwick requested that all people who wished to get onto the internet speak with Hermione, Professor Bell, or one of the two astronomy professors if they wanted to get an account. Hermione was amused to discover that someone had put Duke Nukem 3D on Flitwick's computer, and none of the staff members seemed to know who it was. It was probably George Weasley via Ron, she thought. There were also rumors that a television set with a Sega Genesis had materialized in the Hufflepuff common room. Harry tried to shove the document in her face. Hermione, take a look at this. You're not going to believe it. Hermione batted it away and tried to turn back to her book. Not now, Harry. Harry spoke right over her. Going to be very happy when I tell you that Spill's mission has just taken a tremendous step forward, thanks to the United Nations. Hermione put the book down and gawked at him. What? Harry, grinning furiously, showed her the document once more. This time, she took it and started to read. Her eyebrows headed for the ceiling as soon as she read the first few sentences. United Nations grants human rights to all sentient hominids. After extensive discussion with Ambassador DeLorean and members of the British organization known as the Society for Preservation of Intelligent Welfare, the United Nations has passed a resolution which will grant human rights to many hominids capable of speech. This resolution will go into effect on January 1st, 1997. Ambassador DeLorean, a member of SPIL, explains, "We have known for many years that many species other than Homo sapiens are intelligent and capable of meaningful discourse with human beings. In the wizarding community, we have two classes of sentient creatures, beings and beasts. With very few exceptions, beings are capable of human or near-human intelligence and are far more civilized than their unusual exteriors would suggest. Most beings are hominids, or at least part human, and in some cases are able to even breed with humans. Some of them may have horns, fins, or tails, but you can look into their eyes and see someone on the same level as you are in virtually all aspects. Beginning January 1st, all hominid creatures with being status will receive the same rights in Muggle countries as humans. These include goblins, elves, giants, fairies, and Vila. Werewolves are also included while they are in human form, as are centaurs and all humans of all races and creeds. Merpeople are protected by this new law as long as they are in forms capable of human speech. Finally, mixtures between these species, such as Ambassador Hagrid the half-giant and Vila Mardel Fleur de l'Aqua, are also considered beings. The United Nations admits that the human race has had a dark history of discriminating against other members of their own species, simply because they appear to be superficially different. Humanity has made great strides over the last few years to rectify this issue, but there is still more work to be done. The difficulty of stopping discrimination, even in our own species, makes preventing interbeing discrimination extremely important. We need to nip this in the bud, as Ambassador DeLorean says. President Andrea Marcali of the Republic of Nestor was one of the first to comment on this resolution. "We of the Vila Republic are glad to hear that the Muggles will be accepting us as equals. As you can tell, we look almost exactly like human beings and can be mistaken for human beings very easily." A quick poll of the people in this room indicated that 98% of them believed I was an ordinary human and were quite surprised to find that I actually was a Vila. This decree applies to Muggle nations represented in the United Nations as of January 1st. Wizarding nations, for the most part, already accept other hominid species as beings and have done so for many years. There is one glaring exception, however, Houyhnhnmland, where President Nihim has returned from exile after the fighting there wound down. He freely admits that it will take a while for the Hermione turned over the paper and saw that it was blank. Jumping up and down in excitement, she shrieked, "Where's the rest of the story? Am I mentioned?" Harry backed off. "I'm sorry, Hermione. I couldn't print out the rest of it because Flitwick imposed a limit of one printed page per person. There aren't that many pieces of Muggle paper out here yet, and the pieces of parchment we usually use are too large for the printers to take them. However, you can rest assured that you are mentioned near the end. I wouldn't be surprised if you're asked to make a statement." Hermione looked at the document again and blinked. DeLorean himself found out about Spiel. How did he do that? Harry shrugged. "I don't know. If I were to guess, I suspect it was either through something you said or through Hagrid. After all, Hagrid is a diplomat now." Hermione's mind raced, and she frantically tried a meditation technique to calm her. It didn't work well, of course. Then again, she needed to start getting into a regular practice. Hopefully, she'd be able to think of something intelligent to say before the Muggle paparazzi managed to force their way past the fat lady, Bagdadarak. Saddam Hussein was ecstatic. No fewer than 35 wizards had agreed to come to Iraq and swear unbreakable oaths to serve him. Granted, they had requested that he accept the version of the unbreakable oath, which wouldn't kill the oath-taker if he or she accidentally made a mistake. He was a bit worried about that. However, he figured that it would be good enough. He didn't have that many wizards, after all, and he didn't want any of them dropping dead because of an accident. The vast majority of them were Muslim or had agreed to convert to Islam. Most of them were Shiite to boot. This appeared to be a match made in heaven. Now the question was, what was he going to do with them? Get back at the United States, beat up on Iran, grab some more oil? He needed to think carefully here. A few hundred miles away, one of the newly sworn Iraqi Death Eaters chuckled as he explained why he agreed to take the break-it-or-die version of the oath. It's simple, Mahmud. When I mean serve him, I meant that I would give him a drink at some point. That technically does count as serving, does it not? Mahmud chuckled. Indeed, it does. The big question is whether it still counts as serving if it's been spiked with veritaserum or hexed or something like that. The first Death Eater smiled. Why, yes, I suspect that it does. Mahmud nearly fell over laughing. Eventually, he composed himself and jotted down a note. You know, that's a clever idea. I'll have all the other Death Eaters do just what you did, swear on their lives to serve him. As long as you give him food at some sort, you've obeyed your oath. If you really want to get creative, you can transfigure him into a tennis ball and hit him with one of those Muggle rackets. The first Death Eater shook his head in mock sadness. I doubt he'd let me transfigure him into a tennis ball. Too suspicious. Mahmud shrugged. Well, it was worth a try. If all else fails, we can kill him, cut him into pieces, and serve him to his ministers. Chapter 405. Bye-bye, Birdie. Saturday, October 26, 1996, outside Shakespeare Residence of Stratford-upon-Avon, United Kingdom, Atlantis, DEFCON status. 416% next up. The Omega Bible Nicholas Flamel couldn't deny it anymore. He was aging, and he had completely forgotten how it had felt since he hadn't aged for, well, about 600 years. One look in the mirror this morning had betrayed it. His hair had definitely thinned, and what was left was almost completely gone. His beard had gone from grey with white streaks to white with grey streaks. He was getting backaches more and more frequently, and although he was able to heal them with some spells he'd picked up in the 17th century, he knew it wouldn't last forever. He figured he had 10 years left, 20 tops. He was having second thoughts about having destroyed the stone 4 years ago. Why hadn't he just Fidelius the stone to himself and let his wife and Hugh in on the secret? That way, the stone would be effectively out of play for everyone other than the three of them. He grimaced. There wasn't much use worrying about it now. The fact that his life was nearing an end had made it more important than ever that he start giving lectures about his experiences and telling everyone what had really happened, especially in the years before the statute of secrecy had come into place, where the wizards actually witnessed things the Muggles would have known about. He had spoken to his wife and Hugh about this, and both of them had agreed. Hugh would leave Hogwarts at the end of the school year and replace him as the Minister of Magic. Hugh didn't have any political experience that Flamel knew about. However, Flamel hadn't had any either. Their main qualification was the simple fact that they had lots of experience in many fields, period. 6.5 centuries worth of experience at their fingertips thanks to their pensives. Once Flamel resigned from the ministry, he and his wife would spend the rest of their days discussing their past experiences on the talk circuit. It would be like teaching the medieval literature class all over again, but without the homework. Yes, they were planning to turn his diary into a movie, The Life and Times of Dr. Nicholas Flamel. The problem with movies, of course, was that in order to be viable for the mass market, they needed explosions and sex and so forth. He knew enough about the Muggle film industry to realize that more often than not the movie didn't match the book perfectly. Since the purpose of this project was to document reality, he could not afford any mistakes in the transmission to film. It could be boring from time to time. Well, the Muggles would have to live with it. Perhaps advertising it as the first 3D would help. There were lots of things the Muggles knew little about. Professor Cachet's involvement with the Black Death, the Native American wizarding shamans killing off the settlers of the Roanoke colony, the real reason Columbus's ships made it across the Atlantic, the terrible circumstances leading to the founding of the Gulliver Consortium, and so forth. It was up to him to clear the air on these. He decided that he would start by spilling the beans on Britain's most celebrated author. As a result, he had agreed to give his first lecture at Shakespeare's home in Stratford-upon-Avon. Looking out over the crowd which had gathered in front of the building, he saw that there were at least 1,000 people there, and that he would have to enhance his voice to get them to all hear him. Hoping that he wouldn't break the windows in the old building behind him, he cast the spell and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Nicholas Flamel Sedai, and I am currently serving as the British Minister of Magic. I admit that I am relatively new to this position, having been called upon to serve my country shortly after the events of Judgment Day. I promise you that will do everything I can maintain stable relations between the Muggle and Wizarding worlds. My trip to this famous house today, however, is not to support the ministry. Rather, it is because it is the first stop on what will be a lifelong tour to explain, once and for all, some of the momentous events I have witnessed over my lifetime, most of which have been recorded incorrectly in history books, both Muggle and Wizarding, as we know it. I believe that I am qualified to do this because, stated simply, I look quite good for my age. I appear to you to be a man of 75 or so. However, I am actually slightly older than that. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the rumors are true. I was born on August 10, 1328. That is right, ladies and gentlemen, 1328. I studied alchemy from a young age and decided to attempt to construct a philosopher's stone after the Black Death ravaged most of Europe. Having seen several people die of bubonic plague, including my infant son Robert, I took it upon myself to ensure that something would always exist to cure virtually all ailments. Needless to say, the fact that I am still here proves that I succeeded after decades of work. However, that is a story for another time. I have come here to tell you the tale of the wizarding scholar Sir Henry Wood. He was born in 1556 in a house 4 blocks from here, died in 1649, and was one of the most learned wizards of the era. He served as Minister of Magic from 1636 to 1647. He was fluent in English, Spanish, Gaelic, Danish, German, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French, and quite possibly Italian as well. The man was a linguistic scholar of the highest degree and governed our wizards with great skill and dignity. He also was a very successful diplomat and mediator. Most of the information on Sir Wood vanished from the Muggle world shortly after the Statute of Secrecy was put in place. However, a few of his works survived, primarily dramatic. They included plays like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and a large number of sonnets. The crowd began muttering excitedly, and Flamel smiled. If this reminds you of somebody, you're not imagining anything. In 1590, when Wood's first plays came out, he decided to publish them under a pseudonym because he was concerned that Muggles would not read plays written by a wizard. After much consideration, he decided to attribute these plays to a middling actor and playwright from these parts, a man by the name of William Shakespeare. The crowd, naturally, began hollering. Shakespeare himself, whom Wood knew from his hometown, was not literate enough to produce any good plays. Besides, he didn't have the international experience and wizarding knowledge to turn out masterpieces. Wood and Shakespeare agreed to split the profits from the plays, with Shakespeare getting 25% and Wood getting 75%. Shakespeare would take the credit in the Muggle world, and Wood would take the credit in the Wizarding world. This helped Shakespeare's own plays gain in popularity and helped him make some money, enough at one point to start his own theater troupe. The Wizarding part of the funds, collected anonymously, went to various charitable agencies, including the Research and Development Fund, which eventually allowed me to finish off the Philosopher's Stone. When Shakespeare died in 1616, Sir Wood considered continuing to release his plays to the Muggles under a different name. He was in the middle of a work called Double Falsehood. At the time, I'm sure you recognize the title as that of one of Shakespeare's lost plays. However, it was increasingly obvious that he was having less and less time to work on his plays. His fame was starting to catch up with him, much as you see with the Muggle royal family today. He was also thinking of getting into politics, as he had done a lot of research to create the plays he had already written, and as I said earlier, became Minister of Magic 20 years later. However, he did manage to write a few more plays, none of which were actually made available to Muggles. The crowd immediately started hollering, "We want the plays! We want the plays!" Flamel, having expected this, smiled. "Don't worry, they're coming out." At any rate, all of his plays were designed to be performed using either wizards or Muggles as actors. Muggles could play many roles, such as Hamlet or Romeo. However, there are scenes where ghosts come into play, as you know. Hamlet's dead father is a good example. Furthermore, there are plays which refer to fairies, such as Titania and Oberon in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Wizards could appear as well, such as Prospero in The Tempest, which reminds me, Caliban was supposed to have been cast as a troll. A wizarding performance of these plays, where the magicians and wizards were actually performing their assigned roles, was a marvel for the guests, and I hope it will be possible for one of these to be performed again. The crowd began cheering loudly and immediately start clamoring to have Flamel organize a performance. Flamel chuckled and nodded. "Ah, yes, I thought you would be asking about that. Well, you will not have long to wait." You see, Amelia Bell, the Hogwarts Muggle Studies teacher, recently reintroduced Sir Wood, under the Shakespeare pseudonym, to the Hogwarts curriculum to get the wizards up to speed on Muggle culture. My wife, of course, found this rather amusing. He pulled her aside and explained a few things to her. Needless to say, she was very surprised. However, she eventually came to see the truth. Professor Bell immediately recommended that the school put on some of Shakespeare's plays in full wizarding form. After discussion with His Majesty and several of the staff members, the school has decided to put on The Tempest and King of the Warlocks for a brief period of time near the end of the first semester. First performance is going to be Tuesday, December 17th, in the Great Hall. Yes, King of the Warlocks was one of Wood's last plays, published in 1631. The last I heard, Flitwick would be playing Prospero, the Grey Lady would be playing Ariel, and nearly headless Nick will be playing Rufus, Laurentio's servant in King of the Warlocks. Tickets will go on sale in a few days, 8 galleons or £40 per person for each play. All proceeds will be donated to the Judgment Day cleanup funds. Flamel winked. "I highly recommend that you mark your calendars, ladies and gentlemen. Rest assured, it will be a night to remember. After all, I saw several of those plays performed when Wood was one of the new kids on the block. Besides, how many of you can claim to have seen an authentic, Shakespearean, play called King of the Warlocks? Communist Party of Houyhnhemland, HQ Hinhim Houyhnhemland. So this is how it works. Any questions?" Advisor Chentria Samnang, Zyland Witch hasn't even finished her sentence yet, and virtually all hands in the room were in the air. "How do you think we could manage without that mobility?" asked Hohepa, a former Yahoo from Chiron's Landing, and added, "I mean, we don't have as many wizards as you. At least not full wizards, with apparition licenses." The witch frowned and responded, "As I said, we haven't seen any working examples of this kind of government above the population of 100. Worse, we've seen it not working well at all through the eyes of those Inuits unfortunate enough to belong to the USSR. But then again, we haven't seen a combination of magic and advanced technology before since, well, ever, next." Sitting in a back corner, some men of the Shining Path's original expedition force were whispering to each other angrily. This is totally not what we signed up for, said one Peruvian. That weirdo system of that foreign witch isn't even decent communism, and she'd have us achieve it peacefully, without revolution. What a farce! Struggling to maintain his feigned expression of anger instead of smirking smugly, Comrade Vasquez, actually Zaphareth Bluestar, undercover merwizard agent, responded. Unfortunately, these ex-Yahoos seem to give more trust to fellow hidden nations people than to us. And face it, they have better credentials than us when it comes to peaceful life. After what those wizards did to this city, I'm not surprised they'd rather avoid war for a time. Still, the complainer insisted, the boss will not take it well if we just give up. Or you say you're willing to tell him personally, Vasquez. Ladder Secret, Location Republic of Peru. No, no, absolutely no, Comrade Feliciano. Actually, Oscar Ramos, current leader of the Communist Party of Peru Shining Path, shouted in the wireless transmitter, his face beet red. We will not heed that false communist's words. Our path, the only true path, is that of revolution. Having it any other way is just a feeble excuse for cowardly inaction, which in turn directly helps the reactionary forces. Of course we won't stop our militant campaign, for 1,000 times no. In fact, it's time to show the world that we really mean business. I know there are some of those half-wizards there, loyal to us. I think it's time we start using them to reenact those bombings of Judgment Day. What do you mean, Vasquez? It's tabooed. I see. Well, then we'll just have to stick with more traditional methods. But I trust your ingenuity, comrade. I know you'll find some way to incorporate magic in our new wave of terror attacks. I command you, Comrade Vasquez, to use everything at your disposal to show the might of the proletariat to all its enemies. Use whatever tools you see fit. I'll be watching you. Putting down the transmitter and looking around to see he's alone, Vasquez pulled out his wand from its fideliest holster and muttered to the empty room. I see fit to use this tool, you delusional criminal swine. Expecto Patronum. Chapter 406. Go Kiss a Dementor. Monday, October 28, 1996, Christians for Humans Headquarters Oblivators Atlantis DEFCON status. Victor Pavlov shook his head as he handed the document to the man formerly known as Pope Urban Roman IX. Holiness, I'm sorry for bothering you, but I think you should see this. Urban looked at the news report and his eyes widened. Slowly, methodically, he read its contents. Finally, he growled and threw report away. Do they honestly expect us to abide by this? Who do they think they are, God? Pavlov chuckled sarcastically. Probably. Judging from all of the grandees who are there, I bet they think they speak for him. I doubt it, Victor. This Samuel character, assuming he is in fact Samuel to begin with, which I'm still not convinced of, has got him under his spell. Not to mention that wizards are starting to join the conference. Pavlov nodded. Indeed. With all due respect, however, it's getting a bit late in the year for Omega to be open. If they want to continue the conference into the colder months of the year, someone is going to have to winterize those cabins in a hurry. Urban crossed himself. I'd rather bring over a sleeping bag and a space heater than subject myself to the mark of the beast like that. Those poor fools, Victor. I hope God has mercy on their souls. And if his mercy comes too late, then it behooves us to break up that conference using any means necessary. Pavlov blanched for a moment as the ramifications sank in. Slowly, he backed off a step. Any means necessary, sir, I doubt I'd go that far. Urban glared at him. We are doing the work of God here, Victor. He has given humanity knowledge for a reason. Had he not intended us to use it, he would not have allowed us to obtain it. Pavlov glowered at him momentarily, then shook his head. Whatever you say, holiness. In the meantime, what do we do about this new Bible they're advertising? Urban grinned. We've already got a Bible, and it's the unalterable word of God. We don't need this newfangled thing they're toting around. If God wants us to change the text of his book, he'll presumably come down and tell us. Pavlov hesitated for a moment. Holiness, One could argue that the fact that the conference allowed to begin to start with could be a sign of God's approval. I personally don't like wizards all that much, but the fact that the vast majority of those theologians are Muggles and were brought together to begin with. Urban gritted his teeth. Yes, and God said wizards were supposed to be destroyed. There may not be many wizards there, but when whoever is in charge is supposedly a wizard and a ghost, that's a rather damning sign. Besides, you've heard rumors that one of them supposedly tried to play God over Sukkot. Pavlov frowned. That I have heard. However, in all fairness, the jury is still out. Urban looked at Pavlov as if the latter were stupid. A wizard disappeared shortly before that manifestation took place. Coincidence? I think not. Cutting off Pavlov's reply, he said, "Tell everyone to buy copies of those new books. Once everyone has a copy, cut out everything that's not in the real Bible and see if it's combustible." Pavlov's gaze was fixed on a point somewhere above Urban's head. "As you command, Holiness." Hogsmeade, Richard Zabini, a former Slytherin whose son was still at school, frowned when he saw that the package was addressed to Dinky, his elf. Since when did elves actually get presents? Wary, he unwrapped the gift and realized what was for almost immediately. The package contained a piece of parchment wrapped around what appeared to be a piece of underwear. The parchment read, "Dear friend, thanks to the actions of the United Nations and the Society for the Preservation of Intelligent Welfare, you are no longer a servant. Go out into the world and make a new life for yourself if you so choose. Sincerely, SPIW, formerly SPEW, the Society for the Preservation of Intelligent Welfare." Countess Hermione Granger, Founders, Henrietta Lansford, Chief Executive Officer, Leonard Culver, Chief Elf Rights Agent. Furious, he tossed the package into the trash. The United Nations had no jurisdiction over him. Who was he to listen to those obnoxious Muggles? At least 2/3 of his friends had lost at least one elf servant over the past 24 hours. It appeared that someone in SPIW had managed to get list of everyone who had owned elves and had decided to give them a bit of a surprise. Well, he wasn't going to fall for that. Just wait until he got in touch with the Death Eater cell which had attacked Hogwarts. Had Blaze been taking astronomy at the time the snake had attacked the tower, things might have been a bit different. But Blaze was excited and ready to go. Supposedly, he, Crabbe, and Goyle were already starting to set up another student group of Death Eaters right under poor Flitwick's nose. He went back to his work when he heard someone rummaging in and around the trash can. He frowned when he saw pointed ears sticking up out of the trash can. Grabbing his wand, he pointed it at those ears. "All right, Dinky, get out of that trash can, go back to work." Dinky didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rummaged a little more. Zabini shot a few hexes in his direction, but the stubborn elf didn't respond. It appeared he had no choice. He had to maintain discipline. Preparing an Avada Kedavra, he threw everything he had at those ears. The ears promptly disappeared into the trash bin, and the green bolt hit the curtain and set it on fire. Seconds later, Dinky came out with a smile on his face. In his hand, he held the sock and the note. Dinky beamed at Zabini. "Master has given Dinky underwear. Dinky is free." Zabini begged to differ. He roared, "No, I haven't. You weren't supposed to get that. I most certainly did not give that to you." Dinky looked at him slyly. Master knows Dinky likes to rummage in trash. He intended to give the letter to Dinky by dropping it in the trash. Zabini bit his lip. So the elf was a bit of a lawyer, was he? Well, two could play at that game. Throwing a book at the elf, he bellowed. "That was not what I had in mind." Dinky didn't bite. Master could have vanished it. But no, Master threw it in a place where Dinky could find it. Zabini was getting fed up. Hitting the elf with an immobilis, he shouted, "Dinky, I'm warning you. I'll give you to the count of 3 to promise me you will go back to work. 1, 2. Dinky's ears drooped momentarily. Finally, he sighed. "Master is right, of course. Release me from the spell." Breathing a sigh of relief, he released the elf from the spell. Winky, still moping, dropped the parchment in front of him and got ready to leave. However, as he was about to leave, the elf stopped and turned to look at the man who had owned him for 19 years. Winky would like to say one thing, master. Zabini stared at him warily. Wand still pointed at the elf's chest, he said, and that is. Winky smiled and extended his middle finger out towards Zabini. Go kiss a dementor, Richard Zabini. Furious, Zabini cast another Avada Kedavra at the elf, only to find the elf disappear before it hit him. The spell hit a wooden table, and it, too, started to catch fire. Zabini barely had time to let loose with an expletive-laden dinky before the fire alarm spells started hooting throughout the building. Chapter 407, Experimental Desalination Plant. Tuesday, October 29, 1996, Experimental Desalination Planting Jedius Relatlantis Defcon Status 4/1. 6% Mickle Oved and Wizard Amamos blinked in the glare of the harsh sunlight. It was devilishly hot here, even by Middle Eastern standards. Then again, could someone possibly expect when you were in a desert area, near the lowest point in the entire world? Amamos raised his hand to silence the crowd, and then nodded his head at a large glass door marked with Experimental Spell Lab 3. Inside the laboratory, wizards were hard at work doing things the Muggles probably had no idea could even be done. The former Hamas wizard began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our great pleasure to introduce the Ein Jedi Experimental Desalination Plant. The sole mission of this facility is to combine Muggle and magical technology to develop a safe, economical, and practical method to turn salt water into water fresh enough to drink. Inshallah, the wizards and scientists in these laboratories will be able to provide drinking water for people all around the world. This project has been sponsored by the Israeli Ministry of Magic and is partially sponsored by the Lone Palt Fund for the Millennium Problems. Mickle Oved continued. The Earth's surface is over 2/3 water, yet very little of it is actually fresh. Even worse, most of the fresh water is stuck in the glaciers of Antarctica and Greenland, where the only people able to benefit from it are the Tsalal community buried deep under the Antarctic ice cap. With large portions of the world lacking high-quality drinking water, magical desalination techniques should improve the livelihood of hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people. One of the reporters raised his hand. Can the philosopher's stone be used to create potable water? Mickle shook her head. I don't think so, sir. However, it is a moot point, as all surviving copies of the Philosopher's Stone have been either confiscated by American wizards or destroyed. Why did you set up the plant here? Shouldn't you have placed this facility on the Mediterranean? Amamos smiled. There's a reason that this is called the Ein Jedi Experimental Desalination Plant. A second is also under construction outside what is left of Tel Aviv, right on the Mediterranean. Although that facility will be hard at work trying to purify water of lower salinity levels, the Tel Aviv facility, formerly known as Experimental Desalination Plant 2, will also be hard at work at trying to deal with radiation and other anthropogenic pollutants. This plant here, however, is the primary desalination one. Mickle Oved cut in. The reason for placing a plant on the Dead Sea is obvious. If we developed a technique for desalination which would only work for the Mediterranean, it is a distinct possibility that the high salinity of the Dead Sea would be too much for the technique to handle. This could still leave hundreds of thousands of Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians with nothing to drink. With the Dead Sea being the saltiest body of water in the world, we're assuming that if it works on the Dead Sea's water, it will work for everything. What happens if the tensions between the Israelis and Palestinians flare up again? I know things have simmered down a lot because of the destruction of Tel Aviv, but we all know there have been scattered attacks here and there. Amamos shrugged. Then the Palestinians and Jordanians get this plant, and the Israelis get the Mediterranean one. Will you be able to extract minerals, such as potash and bromine, from the sea water as you purify it? Amamos nodded. Yes, we will. Once we remove the impurities from the salt, we'll be able to do whatever the world wants with them. Personally, as a wizard, I could use some of the substances for spell components. I don't know what you muggles are going to do with the stuff, but I take it potash and bromine are quite valuable where you come from. I vaguely recall a prophecy which envisions a time when the Dead Sea's salinity will drop to a level appropriate for an inland lake, or at least to the level of the Mediterranean. Will you be able to fulfill this prophecy? Mickle Oved frowned. A prophecy? I don't remember a prophecy about this. The speaker laughed. It's in the Bible, both the traditional and Omega versions. Ezekiel chapter 47. The Israeli minister laughed. Oh, those prophecies. Well, I'm afraid Ezekiel will have to wait. Magically desalinating the entire sea with a wave of a wand is far beyond our capabilities. Furthermore, even if we did, evaporation of the water trapped in the Dead Sea will just raise the salinity again. The crowd murmured a little as Amamos winked at his former adversary. Don't give up hope, Minister. Yes, as far as we know of, it is beyond our capability right now. However, you forget the power of science. For all we know, a technological breakthrough will occur in the next 20 years, which will allow Ezekiel's dream to come true. Mickle Oved laughed. I admire your optimism, Wizard Amamos. However, in the light of recent events involving Samuel and Deborah, I would not be surprised if Ezekiel himself comes back first. The crowd murmured more loudly. Finally, someone at the back of the room asked the obvious question. Are you telling me that Ezekiel was a wizard? Oved shook her head. I do not know of the magical statuses or even the actual existence of any biblical characters other than those of Samuel's era. It's quite possible that Ezekiel was a wizard, or at least saw something magical in that chariot prophecy of his. However, it's more than likely that we will never have proof either way. With issues like this, it is a matter of personal religious beliefs and faith. And that is all I am going to say on this subject. Seredin Northern Ukraine, Yakiv Gavriliuk shook his head. I don't like this, Lilia. It doesn't make sense for them to be gone this long. His wife laughed. They're the Kohuts, Yakiv. They like to travel. I suppose that they've taken advantage of the trip to Atlantis to go explore the Greek islands and possibly the Mediterranean basin in general. The weather down there's certainly better than what we've got up here now. Gavriliuk grunted. That's possible. However, it seems very much out of character for them to go completely incommunicado like that, particularly without telling us. Could they not have phones in Atlantis? Maybe. However, they've got to have some means of communicating with us. Whoever is running the show down there has to realize that the Muggles who won the lottery are going to want to keep in touch with the rest of the world. Lilia frowned. You know, Yakiv, you could be right. Even if they don't have phones, the wizards would have at least given them owls or patronesses or something else. Furthermore, now that I think about it, I vaguely remember Mila telling me that they'd be going down there for a week and would tell us if things changed. Gavriliuk nodded abruptly. That tears it. They've been gone for too long, and I can't imagine them not talking with us for a week. I'm starting to wonder if there was a catch to those wizards' invitations that we don't know about. Lilia snorted. You're being paranoid, Yakiv. We've heard lots of stories about people visiting Atlantis and reporting back to their families. This is Atlantis, for God's sake. Atlantis's mission is to save the world, not wreck it. Gavriliuk swore and started heading towards the phone. That makes this even more troubling. It seems that everyone else has reported back, but the Kohuts haven't. Let me make a few calls here. The Gavriliuk spent the next 15 minutes calling people who were friends with both the Kohuts and themselves. They were horrified to hear that none of them had heard from Mila and Mihalo either. Something very strange was going on, and neither of them liked it. Deeply disturbed, Gavriliuk reached for the general phone book and started leafing through the civil service pages at the beginning. Finding the appropriate phone number, he dialed it and was rewarded with an almost immediate answer. The words began to tumble out of his mouth. "Good evening, sir. I regret to inform you that we have a bit of a problem. I'd like to file a missing persons report, and I'd like for a copy of it sent the Minister of Magic if possible." Chapter 408, Elf Job Fair. Wednesday, October 30, 1996, Hogsmeade, United Kingdom, Atlantis, DEFCON status. 416% next up. Halloween. Salem Witch Trials. Dinky, the elf, was slowly starting to realize that freedom wasn't all it was made out to be. He had been in a state of euphoria for about 6 hours or so, after which his stomach started grumbling. It had suddenly occurred to him that he had to find a place to eat on his own, the first fly in the ointment. And even if he did find food, it would likely be cheap and probably of the same quality as the scraps the Zabinis had given him. Figuring that Spear would know something about how to get himself out of this predicament, they had probably freed lots of elves over the past few days. He brought out a small business card, which had been hidden inside the piece of underwear now sitting, albeit loosely, around his waist. It had Spear's address on it, and a comment saying that any elf in need of advice should go there. Hoping that the Spew office was still open, he snapped his fingers and apparated over to the movement's headquarters. He was pleased to notice that it was still open, and it had a huge banner reading "Welcome Free Elves" waving above the main entrance. However, his joy was tempered somewhat by the fact that there was a very large line of elves snaking out the door. Hoping that he wouldn't die of starvation before he got to the front of the line, he took his place at the back of the line. He figured that it would take several hours for him to make it to the front. To pass the time, he made conversation with the elf in front of him. This elf was named Zippy and had been owned by the Knott family. Dinky listened in horror when she explained how she had been beaten and tortured by her masters. "Master was a Death Eater," she wailed. "He treated Zippy like vermin and had her do all the dirty work." Zippy had hoped that her lot in life would improve after Master was killed in Flying House. However, that was not to be. Zippy was sold to Master's son, currently at Hogwarts, and told to live with her new Master's uncle. Zippy was very sad and wanted to take her own life at some point. Yet Zippy could not do that. Dinky stared at her, and he thought his life had been bad. All he could say was, "Dinky is sorry, Zippy. Dinky feels for you. Dink." That was as far as he got before Zippy flung her arms around him and started crying. The elf in front of her, an old man, spun and glared at her. "In the name of the 5 gods, Zippy, stop doing that. No one is going to hire you if you can't control your emotions. I know I wouldn't." Dinky stared at the old man in disbelief. Had he actually heard an elf use the word "I," placing himself on the same level as the humans? That one word even managed to shock Zippy back into a semblance of sanity. Slowly, carefully, she turned around. Dinky let it out first. "You actually used the word "I," you brave elf." The old man grunted. "Brave? That's nothing. I'm asserting my right to be my own person. I've been wanting to do that for a while." Dinky looked at him in awe. Slowly, he pointed at himself. "What is your name, sir? Dinky wishes to greet you." The old man's response surprised him. "My name is Daniel." Dinky and Zippy's jaws dropped, and it was all Dinky could to gasp. "Daniel, that is a human name." Daniel grinned. "Yes, and I chose it for myself. It means God is my judge, not a human. Of course, I didn't start out as Daniel. I started out as skinny and was under the control of the Macnairs. When I received my underwear, I made a run for it before that executioner's widow could intervene. It took me about 3 hours to choose my name, and by the time I decided what I would call myself, I had gotten a bit hungry. Worried I'd spend the rest of my life regretting that I'd given up free food, I went around looking for Darby." Dinky stared at him blankly. "Darby? Who's Darby?" Daniel's smile broadened. "Darby is the reason we're all here, Dinky. A little over 3 years ago, Harry Potter, yes, the famous wizard, tricked Lucius Malfoy into releasing him. Lucius wasn't happy about it, to say the least. It looks like Spew has been reusing that trick with the rest of us to let us all go. Zippy gawked at him. Harry Potter supports Spew. The wizard who destroyed several of the Dark Lord's Horcruxes is our ally. He does indeed, Zippy. Harry is in fact friends with Hermione Granger, Spew's founder. Hermione was first introduced to Darby through Harry, and when Hermione realized how miserable Darby's life was, she vowed then and there to do something to help the elves. Thus was born Spew, the Society for the Preservation of Elvish Welfare. We now know that organization as Spew. Dinky clapped his hands. Dinky, I see. How has Darby been getting by since his freedom? Well, he was destitute for a while, like the rest of us. Eventually, though, he wound up working at Hogwarts in the kitchen with the rest of the elves there. He can tell you more about it here, from what I've been told. Zippy frowned. Why would Darby be here if he already has a job? Daniel smiled. To encourage elves like us that there is daylight at the exit of the cavern. We can look at him and realize that our troubles will soon end. Officially, he's here to serve as a recruiter for the Hogwarts staff kitchens. Recruiter. Someone who tries to connect employers with jobs. As a veteran kitchen elf, he wants some more help. Supposedly half the elves ran away when Igor Karkaroff took over the kitchen a while back. Dinky scratched his head. What would a human be doing in the kitchen? Daniel shrugged. I don't know, Dinky. However, from what I've been told, he couldn't cook all that well. Zippy was starting to brighten up. There are people willing to give us jobs and food here at Spew headquarters. Daniel smiled. It's not just jobs and food, Zippy. We're talking galleons as well here. Imagine you will be given galleons so you can buy your own food whenever you wish. Dinky couldn't believe what he was hearing. I will have my own money. I won't have to rely on other people for handouts. Yes, Dinky, you can have your choice of the best food you can afford. That is, of course, if you get one of the jobs. I'm hoping to try out for the Hogwarts kitchens myself, though we're going to have open minds here. Who's hiring here? Well, we've got Hogwarts, the ministry here in Hogsmeade, a few places in York, and that pet store which was more or less cleaned out during the fight between Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew over Nagini. Looks like all the Muggles ran away, and Roger wants new employees. There are also supposedly seasonal positions for people who are supposed to wrap presents for Christmas, also for Muggle owners. Dinky frowned. I can work for Muggles. I don't see why not. If you like Muggles, go for it. You'll get a lot of attention, of course. Keep in mind, though, that it can be a double-edged sword. You may get discriminated against unofficially, possibly with taunts and teasing. On the other hand, people with an open mind will likely back you up. Dinky nodded. I'll keep that in mind, Daniel. Zippy turned to him. Do you know which job you have in mind? I'm thinking the kitchens myself. Dinky shrugged. Whatever will take and feed me. I'm not that picky. Daniel glared at him. That's the slave mentality talking, Dinky. You are your own master now. You have rights, and you can choose a job. You need to come to this from a position of confidence. Otherwise, they won't take you. Zippy chuckled. Take a look at the line. Unless I'm mistaken, I doubt they'll take us anyway before this job fair closes down. Daniel shrugged. Hope for the best, young lady. There's nothing you can do about it anyway. The three elves resumed their wait, making their way closer and closer to the front of the line. Dinky was about to start eating dirt when someone came out with free food, which he gobbled up immediately. It was better than anything he'd tasted before. Once he got a job, he'd be able to get food like this all the time. If he could only get to the front of the line. Chapter 409, Halloween in Salem. Thursday, October 31, 1996, Salem, Massachusetts, United States of America. Atlantis, DEFCON status. 4/1. 6% Ed Burchett had heard from many people in the know that Halloween in Salem would be an absolute madhouse. However, nothing had prepared him for this. Route 114 was backed up for miles, and at the rate it was going to tie up traffic on Route 128 as well. He could only pity those people like himself who wanted to go to places like Marblehead and didn't want to touch Salem with a 10-foot pole, or broom for that matter. The exposure of the wizards, along with Guinevere's involvement with an organization, now defunct, known as the Salem Witches Academy, meant that the traditional Halloween festivities would go from ridiculous to completely out of hand. To make matters worse, the Peabody Essex Museum had somehow managed to get hold of a few brooms and other magical artifacts, even though Secretary Ariadne had endorsed Radnor's decree that Muggles should not be using brooms without appropriate training. Ariadne had foreseen that something like this would happen, and had repeated that most of the people who had been killed in the 1692 crackdown had not in fact been witches. She explained that the exhibits in Salem gave people a false impression of what magic was like, and what it was like to be a witch or wizard. Finally, she repeated that most of the people who had been executed had in fact been from Danvers, not from Salem. The only reason that the incident had been known as the Salem witch trials was because at the time Danvers had still been part of Salem. She had done everything she could to keep people away from Salem. Some good that did, however. Burchett turned on the radio to hear that the Quabbin was absolutely mobbed. With two of the towns already destroyed, thousands of people had tried to visit at the same time. The head of the Quabbin Academy of Sorcery, which now included the women's school as well, had eventually given up trying to teach classes when people had started pestering him for tour. The security guards had tried to keep boats off the surface of the reservoir and had eventually given up, letting them visit as long as they did not release any flotsam and jetsam into the water and used paddles instead of motors. Meanwhile, there were rumors that Rebecca Nurse, the ghost of a witch who had been killed in 1692, had made her way off to Salem Willows Park to try to deflect some of the people away from downtown and explain what had actually happened. All that managed to do, of course, was make matters worse, because the people who wanted to visit her still had to get to Salem. There were also reports that some leftover activists from America for Humans was going to protest in Salem. Anything involving America for Humans looked like it was a good recipe for disaster. He looked at the cars around him and was horrified to see no fewer than 3 people dressed like elves. For all he knew, they were elves who knew how to drive cars. 5 people were dressed as witches, and one was even dressed as a mermaid. A shadow passed over him, and he craned his neck to catch a glimpse of a flying carpet. He made a mental note to buy a flying carpet as soon as he got back, if he ever got back. To add insult to injury, he saw someone walking around with a sign advertising the Muggle Apparition Network. Why spend all the time in traffic if we can apparate you to your destination? He was very tempted to park the car somewhere and ask the man representative to send him home. Tomorrow, after all of this hullabaloo died down, he'd go back and pick the car up. He was tempted, very tempted. London Michael Heseltine's remarks were short and to the point. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been an honor to serve as your acting Prime Minister. However, it would be inappropriate for me to stay on too long without taking the will of the public into account. As a result, it is my duty to inform you that my tenure as acting Prime Minister will be ending February 1st, when the Regency Committee and Parliament have promised to identify a permanent replacement. It may be me, it may be someone else. All we know is that the person chosen on February 1st will no longer be acting Prime Minister. He or she will be Prime Minister, full stop. No ifs, ands, or buts. Note that the government has agreed that Nicholas Flamel, the Minister of Magic, is not in the running for this position. Although Minister Flamel appears trustworthy, we cannot forget the last time a wizard tried to run for Prime Minister. Voldemort nearly took us over, and we will never let that happen again. Hogwarts, Flitwick looked at the other staff members. You're sure about this? Moody nodded. We are, Headmaster. We have to show the world that we are trustworthy and do so without relying on those ridiculous eyes, said I vows. That's why there have to be tour of Hogwarts. We need to have the Muggles see for themselves that we're good people and that we're learning about Muggles from one of the Muggles themselves. But what about Britain for Humans? Britain for Humans has regrouped and is thinking of starting attacks again. Patrick Moore threw his hands up. All the more so. If we don't let the Muggles in, they're going to find a way to circumvent our defenses somehow or attack somewhere else in the wizarding world. Remember what happened with Zygonov and the Death Eaters. By giving out Tor, we're going to lure them over to us and hit them with virtually every single security method we can think of. We're going to involve both Muggle and wizarding security tactics here. To be honest, Headmaster, I don't see how anything is going to get past that. Moody continued. We're going to have to let Muggles in at some point. People are going to want to talk to the Muggle King from time to time, and J.K. Rowling will be stopping by to interview Miss Granger. If we don't let Muggles in, on the other hand, they're going to start wondering what's going on here and whether we're doing something to King William. Flitwick groaned. I don't like this. Where are you going to take the Muggles? Well, we'll go into the Great Hall and maybe have them sit in on a few Muggle studies lessons. We'll probably throw in charms and history of magic, because no one would be stupid enough to actually go the wife or apprentice of the Minister of Magic himself. Quidditch matches should also be popular, as well as hoops matches. A new game which was developed in Zelenda as a combination of Muggle basketball and Quidditch. It's played at the Quidditch pitch, but there are bouncing balls and so forth. It's getting pretty popular among the students. Moody continued. At any rate, we're going to enhance the castle's defenses with a permanent charm to prevent polyjuicing. All guests will be disarmed and relieved of all their possessions other than notebooks and cameras. They'll then have to go through Muggle airport-style security checkpoints. Trust me, nothing is going to get by. Mrs. Flamel nodded. Headmaster, I'm personally comfortable with this. We know this castle had good security even before the Muggles got involved. This will just augment that. Furthermore, it would be a great political and diplomatic risk if we didn't take the risk. Flitwick looked at her grimly. Well, if all else fails, we can always say the dementors are still there, at least those of us who aren't Aes Sedai. The Muggles won't know any better. All right, people. I agree. Let's start the tour, and God help us all if this doesn't work out. Russian Ministry of Magic. Tsar Alexei looked at the Muggle attaché and then back at the photographs of the two Muggles. You're saying the Cohots are missing? The Muggle bowed and nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. A missing persons report has just been called in from northern Ukraine. Lyudmila and Mihailo Kohut. The person who called it in, Yakov Gavrilyuk, insisted that the Ministry of Magic find out about this as well. Alexei nodded. That is a wise move, sir. After all, the Cohuts were among the people who earned a trip to Atlantis through the Muggle lottery on October 1st. The Muggle gaped at him. The Cohuts are in Atlantis. I suspect. I don't know why they haven't kept in touch, however. Rest assured that I will relay this information to the Grand Mugwump to see if we can get this ironed out. The Muggle bowed once more. Thank you very much, Your Majesty. The Gavrilyuks will be delighted to hear this. No problem, sir. I'll keep you posted. Atlantis, Dagher frowned. What do you mean the Cohuts are missing? They're right here. I saw them a few days ago. Alex grunted. Well, they appear to like Atlantis so much that they've forgotten to tell everyone that they're still alive. We've got a couple of people in northern Ukraine frantic enough about their safety to file a missing persons report. Dagher nearly fell over laughing. Stupid Muggle tourists. I'll head over the first thing tomorrow morning. Send me the missing persons report so I can shove it in their faces. Alexei nodded. Will do, sir. Over and out. 3 hours later, well after sundown, a package arrived express from St. Petersburg. Wondering how frantic these northern Ukrainers were, he dragged over a candle to look at the document. The first things he saw were the two pictures one of a man and one of a woman. He didn't recognize either of them. He swore to himself, "What the hell?" Chapter 410. The British admit all Qonly wizards. Friday, November 1, 1996, Shap, Abercumber, England, Atlantis, DEFCON status. 416%. Nicholas Flamel looked around at what was left the complex. 4.5 centuries earlier, Shap Abbey had been inhabited by a group of Premonstratensian monks which had turned it into a religious shrine. Everything had changed, however, when Henry Roman VIII broke off from the Catholic Church and dissolved all the monasteries. Shap Abbey soon fell into ruin, with the exception of one tall tower. It would have likely taken the Muggles decades to reconstruct the complex. However, this time the Muggles would have some assistance. If everything went as planned, the archaeological excavation of the site would be done by late spring 1997, and the new buildings would be ready for use in the winter of 1998-1999. The rest of the time would be spent interviewing prospective teachers. Flamel's advisors had initially been in a bit of a bind when Flitwick told them about his plan. Although the Hogwarts headmaster's idea made sense, there was the small issue as to where all of the new students would go. Fortunately, Flamel knew just the places to put the new institutions. After all, he had been born into an era when monasteries had still dotted the English countryside. Most of them were in ruins, like this one. They would not be in ruins for long, however. By the end of the century, most of them would be back in business as centers for education. Flamel chuckled as he imagined the stern monks' reaction to hearing that their churches and homes had been transformed into wizarding schools. He had the distinct impression that they would be turning over in their graves for years to come. Making sure his robe was on properly, he stepped to the podium outside the west tower of Shap Abbey. Headmaster Flitwick stood at his side, as did a Catholic priest. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Headmaster Flitwick and I have journeyed to this ruined monastery to announce a radical change in the way magical education will be handled in the United Kingdom. For over 1,000 years, the pool of wizarding candidates was small enough that the vast majority of the students were able to be taught at Hogwarts. The class sizes were, and still are, small enough so that each student can receive individual attention if need be. Furthermore, it is possible for Hogwarts graduates to pass down their secrets even after their deaths by communicating with the current students through the portraits on the walls and in the headmaster's office." Flamel looked around the room. Everything has changed now thanks to Ziggurat Labs' discovery. The era where only 1 in 10,000 people was eligible for wizarding school is over. The era of 1% wizards, those with the Q gene, has begun. Flitwick continued. "As most of you are aware, His Majesty King William is a Qonly wizard. He has been taking courses in spellcraft alongside the rest of his first-year students. From what I have been told by the teachers, he is an excellent student. He tends to have trouble seeing some of the magical constructs he makes, but that is understandable given the lack of the Z-complex. Although he probably will never be good enough to make the Ministry of Magic, I am fairly certain that he will be able to hold his own as a wizard, as a Muggle, and as a king. King William is taking a dual curriculum this semester, one which has traditionally been reserved for wizarding royalty. He is working extremely hard and plans to take some extra classes during summer. He has become a very conscientious and popular student. I have reason to believe that several well-known young women may fancy him. Princess Madeline of Sweden, if you're listening, I'd recommend that you redouble your efforts if you want to get your hands on him." The crowd chuckled as he continued. "His Majesty's experience has shown us once, and for all that Qonly wizards can learn spellcraft as well with few ill effects. As a result, it is my pleasure to announce that starting in the fall of 1999, the Ministry of Magic will start offering wizarding education for anyone with a Q complex." The crowd began murmuring excitedly. One person in the back suddenly started jumping up and down, and Flamel grinned. Unless he was badly mistaken, someone was about to sign up for the 1999 dual curriculum. Only wizards who grew up in the wizarding community will be able to attend Hogwarts as usual. Only wizards who grew up in the Muggle community will take dual curriculum classes similar to His Majesty. Flamel began speaking once again. Many of you may be wondering why we have called a press conference here at a ruined monastery to make this announcement. The reason is quite simple. You've seen Hogwarts. Where are we going to put all of these extra Q-only students, which outnumber the traditional wizards almost 100 to 1? He stabbed his thumb behind him, indicating the abbey. You're looking at it. The crowd reacted about the way Flamel had expected, disbelief and skepticism. However, he had been prepared. Slowly but surely, he tapped his wand on the podium in front of him and revealed a three-dimensional image of a small castle about half the size of Hogwarts. The model was dominated by the huge West Tower sticking out from the west side. The crowd gasped as Flamel continued. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, with the help of both Muggles and wizards, we are going to rebuild this and many of the other ruined monasteries. They will be reborn as centers of learning, this time for the wizarding community. A full archaeological dig will be performed on each site before construction commences, and any relics, religious or secular, will be placed in a museum on the premises of the school. The schools will be named after the monasteries, so the one over here will be called the Shap Academy of Witchcraft, Muggle Studies, and Wizardry. These new schools will open in the fall of 1999. Students will have 3 choices for housing. In the school itself, in the rooms, which used to be the monks' or nuns' barracks, in the town served by the original monastery, or in their parents' houses, assuming that the parents provide transportation. Note that out of respect for the dead monastics, only students whose gender matches that of the original religious center will be able to sleep on campus. For instance, in this case, boys will be housed in the West Tower while the girls will be living in town. This will successfully segregate the sleeping arrangements while allowing for a co-ed school. The current plans are to introduce 10 schools in 1999, 20 in 2002, and 50 in 2006. These schools will be spread out all across the nation, so that Muggles all of the country can train their children to become wizards. Flitwick spoke once more. Note that Hogwarts will start admitting Q-only students early in the fall of 1997. The Q-only students will be sorted into the traditional 4 houses, plus the new Black House. However, due to space limitations, that they will be given housing in Hogsmeade for the time being. The headmaster smiled. Well, that's about it for us. We'll now take questions. Atlantis, Darina Vovchankaya looked up from her reading when she heard the knock on the door. She frowned. What was going on here? She wasn't expecting guests. Putting away the book on magic as it would blow her cover as Mila Kohat, she headed over to the door and looked through the peephole warily at the 2 men. Hello. One of the men nodded. Mrs. Kohat, we're here on a request from the Ministry of Magic. Do you remember Yakiv Gavriliuk? Vovchankaya froze. She had no idea who this Gavriliuk was. However, the name sounded Ukrainian. She suspected that it was one of the Kohat's friends. Hoping she didn't blow her cover, she called out, Yes, sir, is there something wrong? Did something happen to him? The other man's pocket suddenly started shaking, and his eyes widened. He turned to his colleague and nodded. The first man returned the favor and turned back to Vovchankaya. Ma'am, Mr. Gavriliuk is concerned you haven't written back or called him yet. He's been so nervous that he's put out a missing persons report on you. Is it all right if we come in? Vovchankaya's mind raced. Hoping she didn't sound too nervous, she said, Not unless you have some form of id with Death Eaters running around. You could be anyone. The 2 men nodded and reached into their pockets. They both pulled out ids which claimed that they were Muggle liaisons. Both Kohats had been trained, as had all of the Muggles, to recognize them. They were genuine, as far as he could tell. Still wary, she asked, Can you remind me of his phone number? I haven't called him for a while. The two men did so. Hoping that this wasn't a mistake, she told them to hold off for a second so she could try the phone. She picked up the handset and started pushing buttons at random. She had gotten maybe 4 digits in before the line conked out. Shit, she thought. The wizards would want proof that she'd called them. Yet with the phone malfunctioning like this, how could it not malfunction with all the magic around this would be a problem. She returned to the door to see the two men talking to each other. One of them heard her approach and said, "Ma'am, we apologize, but I think we just did something which knocked out your phone. Our spells are picking up a malfunction in there. May we come in so we can fix it?" Trapped, she opened the door and the two men came in. She marched them over to the phone and pointed it out. They nodded, raised their wands, and pointed them at the phone. The first man nodded and began messing with the phone. The second, however, pulled out a piece of parchment and looked at it for a moment. Smiling in satisfaction, he put the parchment away and pointed his wand at her. He then spoke 2 words. Expelliarmus immobilis. Vavchankaya's wand was safely in a drawer, so she didn't lose the wand. However, she still couldn't move. What the hell was going on here? Abruptly, both men reached into their pockets once again and brought out 2 more badges. She blanched when they realized what they were, aura badges. The man with the parchment spoke, his wand still pointed at her face. Meanwhile, the man next to him cast Revelio Hominum. Darina Vavchankaya, you are under arrest, charged with conspiracy, murder, and terrorism at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in Hogsmeade, England. Now if you know what's good for you, help us find your so-called husband and come with us. Chapter 411, Designer Babies. Friday, November 1, 19,962,340, Ziggurat Labs England Atlantis, DEFCON status. 4/1. 9% Wimfer Grigger looked around the lab. The only people left in the building belonged to the janitorial staff, and he highly doubted that they had any idea about what actually was going on in the building, let alone what Grigger was trying to accomplish. Making sure that the view of the video camera was blocked by the secret cabinet containing his experiments, Grigger opened the door and took a look at the contents of the Petri dish. There, sitting in a batch of chemicals, 4 small groups of stem cells were growing and thriving. The cells had initially been taken from an ordinary cell line that Ziggurat Labs had been working with over the past few years. They had supposedly been extracted from umbilical cord blood after one of the secretaries had given birth. This woman, a pure Muggle, had figured that it couldn't hurt try donating some of her stem cells to science. Ziggurat Labs tended to do a lot of work with genetic testing and occasionally genetic engineering. All of the equipment the company had purchased over the past few years had paid off in gold, and a Nobel Prize once the wizards had been outed. Had Michael Parsons not convinced the president of the company to commit all of that cash to genetic testing equipment, someone else would have likely walked away with the secret of the Q and Z genes. Grigger had managed to commandeer some of these stem cells for a little experiment of his own, one which no one else in the company knew about. One of the batches of cells in the cabinet was a control group, which were growing under circumstances familiar to anyone who worked with biological material. A second group consisted of cells which had been modified to have the Q gene. Having been on the team which had helped Parsons identify the wizarding genes, he had an ample supply of the stuff. A third group contained cells which had been primed with the Z gene. As far as he could tell from his last observations, these 3 groups of cells seemed to be doing what they were supposed to. This would have been a major breakthrough on its own. However, the key experiment lay in the 4th container, where the cells had been injected with both the Q and Z complexes. There had been some cell death in that group. About 20% of the cells had disappeared somewhere between the 16 and 32 cell stage. Thankfully, there hadn't been any problems since. That 4th group of cells were his ticket to glory. Once he was convinced that the QZ-enhanced cells were viable enough to be used in experiments, he planned to go into the black market and start advertising a service which would allow volunteers to try to bear children guaranteed to be capable of magic. It didn't matter whether one of the parents, or both of them, had started out as Muggles. Grigor's job was to make sure that wizards could be born ex nihilo out of a situation where neither parent had magical ability, which, of course, covered about 96% of the world. It had taken him many, many tries to reach this point. After all, genetic engineering wasn't easy. He had used various techniques to try to get the cells to accept these new DNA strains, only to find most of them dying between the 2 and 4 cell stage. Eventually, he had stumbled across a gene splicing method which worked. He amended that thought, worked at least for now. How many cells did he have there? A few hundred. There were many, many more than a few hundred cells in a living human being. For all he knew, all of these cell cultures would self-destruct in 2 or 3 days. He started examining the 4 clusters of cells more closely. The control group seemed to be working more or less the way he had expected. The Z group still seemed to be going strong, though some of the cells around the periphery seemed to be a bit ragged. The Q group had, for some reason, split in 2. He didn't know if it was from the presence of the Q gene or whether the blastocyst had naturally twinned. He would have to run this experiment again. The QZ group seemed to be very unhappy. There weren't as many cells as he had expected, and a few of them seemed to be starved for nutrients. He wondered if activating the Q and the Z together had consumed so many of the nutrients on the Petri dish that there wasn't enough food left to go around. If that was the case, this culture would die off in a few days. This theory assumed, of course, that the Q and the Z had already been activated. He had no idea if that was the case. There was evidence that the Q had done something strange, as it had twinned that culture. That wasn't conclusive, however, and it certainly wasn't enough to merit him another Nobel Prize. It was increasingly obvious that this latest set of QZ cells was going to be another failure. However, he had definitely made progress. The culture had lasted almost a week before collapsing. Would the cells last longer if he provided them with more food? He made a mental note to try to find a witch who had borne children and ask her whether she needed to eat more food than a Muggle during pregnancy. Jotting down notes on his most recent observations, he turned to the next set of Petri dishes which were trying to implant G1, S, B, T, and a whole host of other complexes into the base stem cell template. The G1 cluster seemed to have larger cells, which was consistent with gigantism. The Bs looked normal for now, and the Ts were half dead. There was still a lot of work to be done here as well. He wondered how long it would take for him to be confident enough in his results to try to move on to animal and primate experiments. Checking for the Q was easy. Give the chimp a wand, and if the chimp howled and dropped it immediately, the animal didn't have Q active. For the Z, all he had to do is have a ghost volunteer come into the room with the chimp. If, as the theory claimed, the Z gene allowed you to see ghosts of species other than your own, a chimp which reacted to the ghost would mean that the Z was active. This assumed, of course, that the chimps weren't close enough to Homo sapiens for the animal to see the ghost anyway. He figured he could make a killing creating wizards via genetic engineering. He'd have to do it in secret, of course, and possibly set up the lab in a remote location so no one would be able to find it. He expected a Q enhancement would go for £300,000, a Z enhancement for £100,000, and a QZ combo for £500,000. The other complexes would be cheaper. £10,000 for half-giant genes, £50,000 for the T gene, £25,000 for the Siren gene S, £30,000 for Parseltongue ability, and so forth. As he continued examining his cultures, Grigor wondered whether he should get a wizard in on the act. The wizard would likely know more about what all these genes did than he did. Grigor also suspected that he would likely be able to do something to these cultures, which will make them more viable and cause them to develop more quickly. It occurred to him that Herald Green Pharmaceutical Corporation might be willing to help him. They had fallen upon hard times now that the wizards had run away with their philosopher's stone. Their stock had tanked, Daniel Green had been forced out, and Lou Herald had taken over as sole president. Grigor suspected that Herald would likely be shown the door pretty soon unless something drastic came along. Well, Grigor was working on something drastic. If they joined forces, things could be very, very interesting. Particularly if Harold Green had some philosopher's stone information left over which could possibly, just possibly, be reverse engineered. He finished his observations and turned off the light just as the clock struck midnight. He had been in there for less than an hour and a half. Before he left, he took a quick look at his real project, the lycanthropy vaccine. Things seemed to be working pretty well there, and Harold was pretty excited. Granted, a large infusion of cash from the Emperor of Lugnag hadn't hurt. At the rate things were going, clinical trials would likely begin before the end of the year. If all else failed, he could give up on the genetic engineering and make his fortune off the lycanthropy vaccine. However, he did not intend to fail. Not by a long, sharp ministry of magic. Andes Faciliticandor, Piku Peru hidden in the mountains surrounding Machu Picchu, was the secret ancient school and headquarters of the Inca Empire's wizards. They weathered the Spanish conquest there, waiting under the leadership of the wizarding Sapa Inca for a day to reclaim their land. That day never came, and the royal bloodline ended in the Roman 18th century. But over the decades as Muggle cultures mingled, so did wizarding ones. Today, the Minister of Magic, Eligio Porphyrion, had Spanish and Inca ancestors in equal number. Traditionally, Peruvian wizards were considered isolationists, mingling with mundanes even less than the sows allowed, even keeping heads of state off the loop if they deemed their regimes transient, and even after the breach wizarding facilities remained classified with entrance limited to high-ranking government officials. Harboring some resentment over the past inaction of their wizards, the people of Peru were nonetheless pleased when Judgment Day came and went without battles in the country. That would change now. Earlier that week, President Fujimori was contacted by none other than Atlantis and received from anonymous sources an incredibly detailed report on terrorist activity in the country. Alberto Fujimori had used successful counter-terrorist operations to forge political capital several times in the past, and saw great potential in this one, the neutralization of the entire Shining Path. He already struck several blows at the organization back in 1992, but even mostly crippled, it survived. And he made many enemies when his military took the necessary steps to combat the terrorists, and collateral casualties appeared. But this wasn't going to be a problem now. Along with several hundred pages of records, came maps and pictures enabling apparition, and the sites were already checked by disillusioned wizards and deemed real. The plan will work, Senna President, the Minister of Magic assured Fujimori. They stood on a balcony. In a hallway below them, close to 100 auras and more than 1,000 Spec Ops commandos prepared for the mission. Of course it will, replied the President. The Shining Path ends today. An aide came and reported that the troops are ready for action and are waiting for the inevitable speech from Fujimori. They didn't have to wait long, just until the Minister of Magic casted Sonorous on him. My fellow citizens of Peru, you who have gathered here today are the best of two worlds, and we can proudly say that our cooperation has set an example for all humanity. Together, we will build a better world. But there are some individuals in this nation, certain irredeemable louts, who wouldn't let us prosper. Men who resort to intimidation, bombings and assassinations to force their twisted ways on normal people, and who don't hesitate to become drug lords to support their unholy war against our nation. I speak, of course, of the Shining Path, the very thugs you'll fight against today. When you see them, remember all the suffering they brought to our beloved Peru, and to make a better life to our children, don't let a single one escape. Let all know that as long as I am your president, terrorism shall never be tolerated. Gentlemen, let's bring them hell. Shining Path HQ safe house, somewhere in an abandoned mine. Deep beneath the earth in a quite elaborate base, Oscar Ramirez Nam de Guerra, Comrade Feliciano, leader of the Shining Path, smiled. For the first time in 5 years, the organization managed to actually increase its power. The revelation of magic brought unexpected developments, though Alquada had beaten them to the most destructive applications, nukes, and their actions resulted in the worldwide ban on the most obviously useful spells, Engorgio, Geminio. All was not lost. The alleged revolutionary force had always been eager to take what the black market offered, and since the breach, all sort of magic-related stuff appeared there, up to and including mercenaries. Some of those weren't particularly useful in Muggle hands, yet other things showed serious potential. For example, a shady fellow traded an easy, mass-producable, and very potent something for a kilogram of caulking. Oscar couldn't wait to see his little Deathbringers wreaking havoc among the Revolution's enemies. For now, he could only chuckle at the thought that if his acts were known, he'd have to add Peta to the long list of his enemies. His musings, however, were cut short by sounds of gunfire in the tunnels. Same facility, earlier. With a crackling sound, muffled almost into nothingness by a spell, a disillusioned aura apparated into a locked storage room, looked around to make sure no one is there, disapparated, and returned seconds later with 2 commandos at his side. He repeated the process a dozen more times until the room was filled with soldiers and equipment, then opened the door with Alohomora. Silently, squads of commandos began spreading out through the base, and the wizard resumed the side-along apparitions to bring further reinforcements. The insurgents had no idea they were there, until over 100 Special Forces agents were in the middle of their base. And by the time one of them stumbled upon a squad, shouted an alert, reached for his sidearm, jumped behind a corner, and managed to get a few shots out before going down in a hail of bullets. By then, the soldiers were in position to cut off all escape attempts. But the rebels didn't surrender and managed to put up a hell of a fight. At last, the commandos managed to spot Oscar Ramirez fleeing deeper into the base. Chasing him, a squad of soldiers came to a great hallway with rows of tables on the sides packed full of strange boxes. They were small, about 20x10x10 centimeters, with small holes in them but a second layer blocking view, a small cage door in the front, a larger one on the top wired shut, and miniature levers on the side, and a post-it with numbers on each box. Ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. As they looked around in surprise, searching for the inexplicable mind-dwelling frog, Ramirez glanced out from behind the doorway on the opposite end with a hand mirror and tossed a grenade in the hallway. A boom was followed by splintering of furniture and screams of wounded men. Then a rising, infernal hiss joined the cacophony. Of the many fearsome beasts and monsters that roam our land, there is none more curious or more deadly than the basilisk, known also as the king of serpents. This snake, which may reach gigantic size and live many hundreds of years, is born from a chicken's egg, hatched beneath a toad. Its methods of killing are most wondrous, for aside from its deadly and venomous fangs, the basilisk has a murderous stare, and all who are fixed with the beam of its eye shall suffer instant death. Spiders flee before the basilisk, for it is their mortal enemy, and the basilisk flees only from the crowing of the rooster, which is fatal to it. Hatching a basilisk is easy. Both toads and chicken eggs are commonly accessible. Dark wizards had been doing it for centuries. But they didn't exploit the easiness of the process to its full potential. In this hallway, there were hundreds of boxes, each with 2 compartments. One was just big enough to put in a toad and an egg, and so small that the toad had no choice but to sit on the egg. This compartment had an hatch on the top for putting in the toad and the egg. Then it was sealed shut. Once the baby basilisk hatched, it ate the toad. Then handlers periodically placed live mice in the other compartment, closed it, pulled a lever to open the door separating the compartments, let the snake feed for a few hours, then picked up the box, shaked it down into the smaller compartment, and closed the door with the lever. They started a cluster of eggs each day, and by now many has hatched. The boxes were designed to let air and small objects like excrement pass, but absolutely no light. And though they were quite well constructed, they were intentionally weak. The shockwave of the grenade knocked many tables open and flinged boxes around. Many basilisks ended up dead or crippled, but many more ended up free and enraged. Newborn basilisks were around 10 centimeters long. Their poison was already full potent, but their lethal eyes were not until their third molting, by when their size tripled. Even a direct stare only caused petrification, and an indirect one led to fainting. Because of this, they started out hunting by scent and hearing, and with their eyes closed they could not eat rock. However, it was still their favorite defensive mechanism against perceived attackers, in this case the big warm bloods making noise. Soon, wounded and healthy commandos alike thudded on the floor with cracks, their flesh turned to stone. Hearing the lovely noises of panic and mayhem, Ramirez smirked, but his expression turned sour when he evaluated his situation. He was cornered. The corridor he stood in was ultimately a dead end, and the only way to escape was through enraged, deadly snakes and equally pissed-off counter-revolutionaries. Well, at least he'd go out in battle like a hero, setting an example for the proletariat. Yes, he could do that. As the shouting increased in the other entrance of the hallway, he tensed, and when he heard a soldier suggesting to throw grenades at the snakes till they were silenced, he springed from behind the doorway, grenade armed and poised to throw, trajectory already calculated so it would fly through the hallway and land at the other door. But a little something dramatically altered his plans. Two little somethings, to be exact 2 small pinpricks at his ankle, and an instant wave of dizziness sweeping through him. Refusing to believe what in his heart he knew, that he only has seconds to live, he looked down, desperately hoping for anything but a snake at his feet. Fate was cruel to him. His expression had managed to strike the perfect balance between complete despair and utter horror before the reptile's eyes found his, and he turned into stone like that. Then the grenade exploded in his petrified hand. Ministry of Magic, Andes Faciliticandor, PICU Aftermath. Look, is that really necessary? Asked the president, and not for the first time. The minister of magic sighed and facepalmed. Senna, President, I already told you of the dangers of basilisk breeding. If you don't want those monsters released in your cities, that knowledge can't get out to Mug. Mundanes. Anyone who has seen it has to be obliviated or killed before he talks about it or writes about it. Don't let today's events fool you, President Fujimori, for our cleanup teams did a great job. But if even a single mature basilisk would be released in a crowded city, today's few dozen casualties would be laughable low. Please, let us obliviate your soldiers and their captives now. Fine, shrugged the president. Take their memories, just take care not to mess up their heads. Then he pointed down at the petrified, mutilated body of Oscar Ramos. What of him? Any chance of reviving him so he can have a trial? Is he alive at all? The wizard shook his head. He is alive, but he was bitten before petrification and badly damaged afterwards. Even if we found a healing spell to rebuild him and some phoenix tears as antidote, chances are he'd be dead before the antidote took effect. Realistically, he's either kept as a statue locked in agony for all eternity, or he is given the petrification antidote and allowed to die. Normally, I'd say a being deserves the latter, but I hear this man is responsible for thousands of deaths, and worse. Indeed, said Fujimori with a smirk. So, I either set an example by granting him a mercy kill, or I set an example by letting all see how terrorists end up here. Decisions, decisions. I don't follow Muggle news too close, but didn't some terrorist named Che Guevara end up being famous and popular after he was displayed in such a manner? You have a point, the president admitted. Give him the petrification antidote, and get rid of the body discreetly, then. Chapter 412, Singing in the Rain. Saturday, November 2, 1996, Atlantis DEFCON status 4/1. 8% Darina Vovchankaya was not a happy witch. The undercover auras had frog-marched her and her husband out of the house and had escorted them into a pair of apparition-proof cells with no view whatsoever of the outside. They had then told her to make herself comfortable and locked her in. Then the wait began. She'd a talk to, and she thought that she was going to go out of her mind. She wondered what had happened to her colleague. They had taken him from her shortly after locking her in the jail. She could have sworn that she had heard him screaming from time to time. She prayed briefly that that was not the case. Besides, most of these people had sworn at least novice-level Aes Sedai oaths. This meant that use of magic as a weapon was forbidden unless the oath-taker was fighting a dark wizard. She and her friend were certainly dark wizards, at least from the misguided Atlantean view of the world. However, she couldn't imagine how they could be torturing him if he wasn't fighting them. Then it occurred to her they could be using Muggle tactics which were often far more barbaric than magical torture. Crucio was exceedingly painful, but it didn't cause any permanent harm. Muggle techniques, on the other hand, she shuddered. She didn't even want to think about that. She wondered if Zyganov and Rasputin knew that they had been captured. If Atlantis played its cards right, which she had to admit was a strong possibility given Dagher and Dionysus's power, they'd just have her vanish without telling Rasputin where she went. There was also a distinct possibility that they could try to force her to betray all of her secrets using Veritaserum or some other method. She really hoped that was not the case, as she was not allowed to betray Kashe without permission of Rasputin. An unbreakable vow had seen to that. She had no idea how much time had gone by since her arrest. She had long since finished counting the number of bricks in the walls. 1457. The wizards shoved food through the wall at irregular hours, undoubtedly designed to make sure she didn't know what time of day it was. The food wasn't all that great, but it was a hell of a lot better than anything the Muggles would have been able to produce. She had told everyone that she was willing to die for the cause. However, now that the moment was upon her, she couldn't do it. What use would she be, dead? As long as people lived, there was still hope. Granted, there wasn't much she could accomplish without her wand, and she highly doubted that they would agree to her request to get her wand back. She hoped that her colleague would be braver than she was. She was man, after all, and men were supposed to be brave and sweep women off their feet. She broke off her reveries as she heard footsteps approach her cell and stop outside her door. A voice shattered the silence. "Prisoner Vovchankaya, we are about to come in. Keep your hands above your head and do not move. Otherwise, we will shoot you. Be advised that we are carrying a device which will allow people to see invisible objects as well as a secrecy sensor. We also have the executioner with us in case you make too much of a mess. Do you agree to this?" She tried to keep her voice steady. "I don't see I have much of a choice. What would you do if I didn't feel like cooperating?" "Then we will make your cell airtight, and you will die a slow, painful death from asphyxiation. It is a terrible, gruesome fate. You do not want to face it, prisoner Vovchankaya." She sighed and put her hands over her head. "All right, come on in." The door opened, and no fewer than 10 wizards marched in. They put her in handcuffs made of devil's snare, wonderful, she thought, and forced her out into the hall. She saw no sign of her colleague and couldn't decide whether they had killed him, turned him, or placed him in a separate facility. They marched her into a dark room with what appeared to be several small leaks in the ceiling. They asked her if she wanted to get a little bath to get rid of the stench of her prisoner's uniform. Amazed at their merciful behavior, she nodded. They pushed her under the leak in the ceiling so that the water drops began falling at random intervals on her forehead. They were brutally cold, and she opened her mouth to ask them to raise the temperature. She didn't get far, however, before someone cast Immobilis on her. Suddenly, she found herself motionless, with water dripping on her forehead. She suddenly realized what this was. She wasn't going to be given a bath. She was about to be subject to an interrogation method known as Chinese water torture. And those damned eyes said I called it a bath, so they didn't have to see it as torture. Hoping she wouldn't go insane, she gulped and stared as a man sat at a desk across from her. "Prisoner Vovchankaya, how are you feeling?" She fought to speak. Cheated. "I wanted a shower, and I got this uncomfortable leak in my face." He shrugged. "We're sorry about the discomfort. We'll try to get you out of there as soon as possible, provided that you answer some questions for us." She looked at the floor, unable to move her head. "You're going to torture me, aren't you?" "Not necessarily. You can end it much more quickly by telling us what we want to know. Be advised that your colleague is being interrogated as we speak, and that it is in both of your best interests for you to cooperate. I believe the Muggles call this the prisoner's dilemma. Do you accept these terms?" "I don't see I have much of a choice, sir." "Indeed, you do not. So make the best of a bad situation, and be advised that there is a strong probability that your colleague may confess in order to reduce his sentence and foist all the blame on you." Vovchankaya blinked and winced as water got into her eyes. She could imagine the black fist Muggle telling everyone the witch did it and he was just a henchman. This was not good, not good at all. Sighing, she told the interrogator to begin the interview. The interrogator nodded and pulled out a piece of parchment. "All right, let's get started. Where were you on the night of October 1st?" She looked at him with a straight face. "I was in my apartment with my colleague." The secrecy sensor didn't move after all. She did spend some time in the Zyganov's apartment in Hogsmeade on the night of the attack. The interrogator checked the secrecy sensor and nodded. "This was in Hogsmeade, right?" "Correct." "Did you ever spend any time in the vicinity of Hogwarts, prisoner?" She gulped. "I was definitely in the area of Hogwarts. Then again, Hogsmeade is near Hogwarts, so that doesn't really help much." "I see. Were you inside the Hogwarts castle at all on that night?" She was relieved when she saw the secrecy sensor not moving. She had never actually entered the castle. All she had done was enter the forest and escape via Portkey after doing the deed. The interrogator looked at the man holding the secrecy sensor and frowned. Finally, the man with the secrecy sensor smiled. "Actually, I have a question. Prisoner Vovchankaya, were you by any chance in the Forbidden Forest that night?" She blanched and then winced as she realized her facial expression had given everything away. Hoping against hope, she stammered, "Why would I have been in the Forbidden Forest?" The interrogator glared at her. "Answer the question. Don't play with us." All she could hope for was the secrecy sensor not working. "I don't recall entering the forest, sir." Not surprisingly, the secrecy sensor began shaking rapidly. The interrogator saw it and shook his head. "Don't lie to us, prisoner Vovchankaya, as it will just prolong the agony. So, you were in the forest after all. Did you by any chance hide in the trees, under an invisibility cloak, at the time Professor Snape was killed?" She looked at the secrecy sensor. She was toast, and they knew it. Finally, she gave up. "Yes, that was me. I had the cloak and was hiding in the forest. Let the other man go, he didn't do anything." "He didn't do anything on that mission, you mean? We can't rule out the possibility that he was involved with something else. At any rate, back to the forest. Were you responsible for killing Professor Snape and using a Muggle weapon on Albus Dumbledore?" She let out a soft whimper. "I had no choice. Snape was trying to kill me." "Probably because you had just shot Dumbledore and taken his wand. Am I right, prisoner Vovchankaya?" The game was up. "Yes, sir, I had the gun." The interrogator whistled. "Hugh, looks like we've got a live one here. Let's get some more details here. For one thing, do you still have the Elder Wand?" She blinked. "The Elder Wand? Why would I have the Elder Wand? I took Dumbledore's wand, not the Elder Wand." "You obviously knew Dumbledore had the Elder Wand, prisoner Vovchankaya. Otherwise, you wouldn't have wanted to take it." She stared at the interrogator. "I didn't know." The secrecy sensor stopped moving. She was telling the truth. She knew Dumbledore's wand had been supercharged, but the actual Elder Wand. Now she regretted giving it back to Rasputin. The interrogator was silent for a couple of moments while he pondered this development. Suddenly, the man holding the secrecy sensor spoke up once more. Actually, that makes sense. Someone told her to retrieve the wand for him without telling her it was the Elder Wand, because he wanted the Elder Wand for himself. He didn't want Hit Woman here to be tempted to keep it. The interrogator whistled. Indeed, that makes a lot of sense. So let's go down that line of thought. Who exactly are you working for? Lord Voldemort, the Italian Ministry of Magic, Grigori Rasputin. Her jaw dropped at the mention of Rasputin. She tried to clamp it shut again, even though she realized it was too late. The interrogator smiled evilly. Well, it looks like we've got a lead into Rasputin's camp here. A bunch of Black Guard activists uniting under the Mad Monk's banner. Am I correct? She breathed a sigh of relief. Technically, according to one interpretation, the questioners were correct. That is correct, sir. Rasputin is a Black Guard activist. Yes, sir. Did you give him the Elder Wand after the mission? She grumbled. He demanded it of me. I told her that Dumbledore's wand seemed to like me, and he responded by disarming me and claiming the wand for himself. I'm stuck with my old one. Mr. Secrecy Sensor growled. Shit. Rasputin's the master of the Elder Wand now. We need to find him and find him soon. All right, prisoner Vovchinkaya. Where's Rasputin? I suspect a lot of Romanovs are going to want to hear this. She had dreaded that question. His safe house is under the Fidelius charm, sir. I can't tell you as I'm not a secret keeper. Besides, I've never actually been there. I've met him at designated meeting points, and that's it. Where are these meeting points? Well, we've got a place in Istanbul, a place in St. Petersburg, and a place in Constanta, Romania. The interrogator's eyebrows shot up. What the hell is in Constanta? I don't know, sir. All I know is that we sometimes meet there. Give me addresses, now. Resigned, she turned over the addresses, and the interrogator jotted them down. Thank you for your cooperation, prisoner Vovchinkaya. We'll be done soon, and you'll be able to get out of that leak in the ceiling. Are you familiar with either of the Zygonovs? Yes, sir. I know them both. Were they involved in the attack at all? Telling the truth was getting easier and easier. Yes, sir. Zygonova was the woman who passed herself off Amelia Bell at Hogwarts. She was our mole into the school. Were you there most of the time as well? I was called in to help with this mission. Once Zygonova realized that she would have to be in two places at the same time, serving as Zygonov's husband while keeping Bell's two roommates from noticing her absence. I lived in Bell's apartment with the roommates, while Zygonova herself lived with her husband. Are the Zygonovs actually married? Yes, husband and wife team. What did you do while school was in session? I spent some time exploring the Muggle world to get information for Zygonova to relay to the class in Muggle studies. It was tough trying to find stuff for the course sometimes. The interrogator made some more notes. We appreciate your candor. You'll probably get a reduced sentence out of this. One last thing. Is Rasputin a Death Eater? I find it hard to believe. She couldn't help but grin as she answered the question. No, Rasputin is not a Death Eater, and neither am I. I cast the Dark Mark to frame the Death Eaters. I learned the Dark Mark from a program about Judgment Day and Voldemort. Both men's eyes shot to the secrecy sensor, which remained still. For the first time, their eyes widened in shock. Finally, Mr. Secrecy Sensor swore, Son of a bitch, we've been chasing a false trail the whole time. The interrogator pressured her further. If Rasputin's not doing this to bring back Voldemort, what's his mission? She prayed this would be enough. He is involved with a group which wants to make wizards rule Muggles. Wizard supremacists, you might say. The world is difficult and chaotic, and it is up to the wizards to take control of the Muggles when they misbehave. The interrogator grunted. That's our job. You don't need to cast your lot with Rasputin. You aren't effective enough. People ignore Atlantis all the time, and you don't really do much unless the world is about to blow up. I see. Is Rasputin the head of your cell? Who's his boss? Who's the kingpin here? She chose her words to be carefully ambiguous. I cannot say. I'm sorry. The interrogator looked at the secrecy sensor, which was stationary. He frowned. Well, we'll just have to capture Rasputin and deal with him. Looks like you're pretty low level. What happened to the Kohots? The Zygonovs killed them and took their forms before they arrived on the island. They modified your Muggle id cards so they had their pictures on them instead of the Kohots. Where are the bodies? On Santorini, Zygonov claimed, transfigured into rocks. Where are the Zygonovs now? Don't know, sorry. Mr. Secrecy Sensor shook his head. They could be anywhere by now. Were they ever here on Atlantis? They must have been if they went after the Kohots. Yes, they were. They had originally been tasked with the mission of infiltrating Atlantis, but were pulled out when Rasputin realized that you may be onto us. He replaced them with less famous people. He was about to pull me out as well, but didn't get to me in time. Was he the one who gave you the polyjuice potion? Where have you been keeping the polyjuice potion? The dripping water was really starting to get uncomfortable, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. Sighing, she said that it was in a cabinet at home. Hoping against hope, she then pleaded with the interrogators to let her go back to her cell. To her surprise, they agreed. You've given us a lot of information to work with here. If anything else comes to mind, tell us. With luck, you'll be able to reduce your sentence further. She nodded. Within an hour, she was back inside her cell, hoping she hadn't revealed too much, and that Rasputin or Kashe wouldn't kill her for it. Chapter 413. Ron punches the king. Sunday, November 2, 1996, Gryffindor Tower Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Atlantis, DEFCON status. 418% Harry Potter woke up and felt like a million galleons. The sun was out, and the temperature was probably in the teens somewhere. He had more energy than he knew what to do with, and he felt like he could take on the world. How could this be? He hadn't done anything unusual over the past few days. Yes, he'd won a Quidditch match, though his work as a sixth-year seeker had been interfered with somewhat by the dementors hovering around the pitch. At least he hadn't fallen off his broom a few hundred feet up in the air like he had 3 years earlier, when the monsters had been protecting the castle from Sirius Black. School had slowly settled back into a routine after the Death Eater attack. Hermione spent most of her time meditating, trying to oversee Spew, helping J.K. Rowling work on Hermione Granger and the Philosopher's Stone, and reading in the library. Occasionally, she even had time for class. Harry wondered if she had stumbled across another time-turner, and Flitwick was turning a blind eye. Ron had been fighting his way through Slughorn's potions class, convinced that he would also become an Auror at some point. Ron's ability as a keeper had improved, and he had gotten a little more popular at school. He had managed to pick up a new nickname, Count. Considering that he was going out with a girl who was a countess, that made a lot of sense. Granted, the skinny redhead had had to endure taunts from people like Crabbe and Goyle, his supposedly not being able to count. He had managed to restrain himself to the point where he'd only gotten detention twice. Ginny had been shaken badly by the attack on the astronomy tower. She had told Harry that had the attack occurred an hour later or so, she would have likely been killed or eaten by the snake. Harry didn't want to even think about that. She had become an integral part of his life now. Hell, he even lived at her house now when school wasn't in session, and he couldn't imagine life without her. He was doing everything under the sun with her now, including several things both Ron and Hermione thought he'd get into big trouble if either her parents or the school staff found out. He felt so brave today that he decided to ask her for another anatomy lesson today. King William, a.k.a. Mr. Windsor, had spent most of the time since the attack trying to turn on the charm for Hermione. It was obvious he had fallen for her. What would you expect for a kid who had just turned 14? Although Hermione was a good 3 years older than him, she appeared to be at least somewhat considering the idea of dumping Ron for William and becoming a princess. Harry was still trying to figure out whether he should break this to Ron and then run for the hills. The king had proven to be a passable wizard, thanks to the assistance of the Wizarding Queen and the Korean chap. He would likely never be able to do everything an ordinary wizard could. However, he wouldn't embarrass the profession. Harry opened the window to take a look outside. He scanned the area around the castle and thought something seemed a bit strange. What was it? The sun was out. There were a few birds left in the trees. The whooping willow was beating up on a pigeon. Happy thoughts were coursing through his mind. Happy thoughts. Suddenly it hit him. The dementors were gone. He ran around the floor, throwing open windows to see if they were anywhere in sight. They weren't. The 1-month siege of Hogwarts had finally come to an end. The noise of him racing through the dormitory woke up most of the boys on his floor. Their irritation about being woken up early on a Sunday dissipated very quickly when they realized they were all in a better mood than they had been for over a month. Soon, everyone was cheering. Ron hurried to get dressed. Thank God they're gone. With them hovering around here, we couldn't do anything fun. Do you know what happened? Did they catch the guys who did it? Harry's reply was interrupted by a squawk as an owl suddenly flew into the dorm and dropped a rolled-up parchment in Neville's hand. It looked to be a copy of the Quibbler. Considering that Neville and Luna were rumored to have hooked up, it made a lot of sense. Harry could just hope that Luna would be able to save Neville. Once, Flitwick realized that an owl had flown directly into the dorm without first stopping in the owlery. Neville took one look at the headline and started waving the paper around. It's a Quibbler extra. It's talking about the Dementors. Everyone crowded around as he began to read. Dementors removed from Hogwarts, Hogsmeade. Happy days have returned to the citizens of Hogsmeade and Hogwarts. For the first time in over a month, the residents of these locations will not have to deal with Dementors in their midst. Dr. Nicholas Flamel, our Minister of Magic, offered an explanation. Late last night, word came in from Atlantis which shed some light on the actions of the Death Eaters in the area. After carefully considering this new information, the Ministry has concluded that Hogwarts and Hogsmeade are no longer under a magical terror threat from the Death Eaters. The Death Eaters were removed immediately during the night, a development which will please virtually everyone in the area. The Minister, however, could not reveal everything. Although many of you wish to know who exactly attacked Hogwarts, the Ministry cannot provide any additional information at this time. The investigation is still ongoing, although we now know for certain that Hogwarts will not be targeted again by you-know-whose organization. Ministries of magic all over the world are going to be collaborating in track down the killers. As Minister of Magic, I regret having to withhold information like this. Unfortunately, we cannot reveal all of our information without possibly tipping off the killers to the fact that we are on their trail. The only person outside the upper levels of the Ministry to know the entire story will be Professor Flitwick, headmaster of Hogwarts, and Alastair Moody, the school's defense against the dark arts teacher. Madame Rosmerta, a resident of Hogsmeade, was ecstatic about this development. It's about time those black-caped monsters left Hogwarts. Everyone has been moping for the past 4 weeks, and no one has spent any time in the 3 broomsticks. I've had so few customers that I've often found myself closing the shop and sending everyone home. Now that the Dementors are gone, the tavern should find itself brimming with customers once more. Ron began whooping it up. Way to go, Flamel. He may not have specifically campaigned for Minister of Magic. However, I can't help but think that someone who's been around 600 years has certainly got more experience and wisdom than any of the politicians like Fudge or Scrimgeour. Neville chuckled as he rolled up the newspaper. Amen to that, Ron, amen to that. Harry frowned. They haven't caught the guy who did it, it sounds like. I'm not sure how safe we are, to be honest. I think we'd better reconvene the original Dumbledore's army group from last year and see if there's anything we can do to help out." Neville frowned. "I don't think so. I trust Flamel, he knows what he's doing. Besides, how are we going to get out of school? We can't even leave the castle to visit Hogsmeade. How are we going to help here?" Harry nodded somberly. "You're right, Neville. Maybe I can use my cloak." Ron rolled his eyes. "You gave the cloak to Moody, Harry. Besides, you by yourself can't do much." Neville scratched his head. "Maybe we should talk to Hermione and use her new star power to help out." "Aye." A first year stuck his head in the door. "Hey, guys, come on down. Professor Dumbledore wants to talk to us in the common room." "Which one?" The first year blinked sheepishly. "Oh, Aberforth. Albus is still retired, as far as I know." Harry followed the rest of his friends down into the conference room just in time to see the students celebrating and Aberforth making his way out through the portrait hole. Hermione, clad in a very interesting-looking nightgown which was making Ron's eyes as wide as saucers, headed over to explain. "The Ministry is continuing the investigation into the attack on the astronomy tower. They're not certain which Death Eater did it, of course. However, what they are certain about is the fact that Hogsmeade is no longer going to be threatened. The dementors have left, guys. In case you're wondering why you feel so happy this morning, that's why. Oh, and they're all letting us go into Hogsmeade today to celebrate." Ron's eyes widened. "Yes, unplanned field trip." Harry smiled. However, his face turned serious again. "Hermione, do you think I'll be able to get my cloak back?" Hermione frowned. "I doubt it, Harry. If the Death Eaters are still planning on taking the cloak and Flamel is convinced that Hogwarts is safe, the obvious implication is that the cloak has been moved out of the area. And even if it is in the area, there's no way you'll get it back, as it will draw the attackers right back here." Harry groaned. "Damn. Well, at least we got a Hogsmeade trip out of it. Let's find Ginny and get going." Harry had been on many Hogsmeade trips before. This, however, was the best of them all. The place was mobbed as virtually everyone was out celebrating. He had kissed Ginny several times and gotten her some candy at one of the stores. Ginny had surprised him and bought him a set of British football cards at a Muggle store. Ron, of course, had no idea who any of the players were. Neither did Harry, though his excuse was a bit different. Hermione had left a little early to hang out with Lavender Brown and a couple of other girls. Ron had ogled her for a minute and begged her to stay, but she argued that he would be able to put himself to better use serving as a chaperone for Harry and Ginny. Harry didn't like the idea of Ron serving as a chaperone, but Hermione did have a bit of a point. 3 hours later, Harry, Ron, and Ginny started making their way back towards Hogsmeade with the rest of the group. He wondered where Hermione, William, and Laura Spencer were. He figured they'd show up eventually, however. Hermione wasn't one to miss school. And if the monarch wound up missing either Muggle or wizarding, there would be hell to pay, and the government would find the person very quickly. Ron looked down an alleyway and suddenly froze. His face went beet red as Harry crashed into him. Apologizing profusely, Harry asked Ron if something had happened. In response, Ron just pointed. Besides him, Ginny gasped and winced. Harry followed Ron's outstretched finger to see William kissing Hermione. Next to them was Laura Spencer, who was frantically trying to separate the two of them. Ron started marching towards them with fury in his face. "I'm going to kill both of them." Harry and Ginny tried to pull him back. "For God's sake, Ron, she can't be interested in him. He's half her age." "Okay, I'll just kill him then." Harry shoved him up against the wall of the alley. "You can't kill William. As far as the Muggles know, he's the king. You're going to get the entire British Secret Service after you if you do that. Besides, you remember what you were like when you were 14. Ron wasn't listening, however. Harry and Ginny tried to catch up as she closed in on Hermione and William. Laura Spencer jumped in between them. "Ron, this isn't what you think it is. Out of my way." Ron tried to shove her out of way unsuccessfully as Hermione spun and stared at him. Realization suddenly dawned in Hermione's eyes. Slowly, she began to back off. Oh my, oh my. Ron glared at William. Well, what do you have to say for yourself? Hermione is mine, William. William shrugged. I'm the king. In theory, I could always call for your head to be chopped off. Everyone started screaming until Laura clapped her hands. You can't do that, William. I know, Magna Carta and all that. I told you, you're acting like an idiot. Every single guy does when he's 14. Ron, of course, then proceeded to play the idiot by starting to beat up on William. He actually managed to land a few punches before everyone else managed to separate them. Finally, sporting a bloody nose, he turned to glare at Hermione. Well, what exactly was that? Tutoring. Hermione flared at him. I must admit, I was intrigued by the possibility of being queen for a while. However, you're right. He's way too young for me. Besides, I know a sure thing when I see one. Ron blinked. So you're not going out with him? I had debated it for a while. However, I've decided against it. At least I had before you started beating up on the poor kid. Ron's face reddened again, and Harry and Ginny pulled him back while Laura checked to see if William was injured. I was being stupid. I apologize. Hermione wasn't convinced. You'd better apologize. Otherwise, I may just change my mind. I don't go out with bullies. Ginny and Harry promptly started pestering Ron to come to his senses. Finally, he did. Giving Hermione a kiss and ignoring William's glare, the sixth years headed off back towards the castle with Ginny standing between William and Ron. Suddenly, Hermione stopped. Saying she dropped something back in the alleyway, she headed back to Laura as the other students headed for the castle. Laura shook her head when Hermione approached. William does have a thing for you, Hermione. However, I agree that he's way too young. Besides, would the Muggles seriously like an active witch being the king's consort? Hermione grinned. Maybe, maybe not. Tell William that we'll have to just stay friends for now because the age difference. I remember a bit about that time in my life myself, and I can understand where William is coming from. Laura nodded. I will. I hope he doesn't go to pieces over it, though. I hope he doesn't either. After all, who knows? 10 years from now, when he's 24 and I'm 27, things could be different. Laura stared at her. You're still somewhat interested. Quite possibly. However, that's just between the two of us for now. For the time being, I'm fine with Ron in the future. We'll see. After all, how often does one marry your first boyfriend as a teenager?